Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring a dynamic that has impacted pretty much all of us, personally and professionally. Last year, as I transitioned my human risk business from being largely face-to-face with virtual as a backup to entirely virtual, I wanted to learn how to be more effective at communicating digitally. After all, if you're going to talk to compliance, ethics, and risk people about engaging their employees, then you need to live the values in the way you communicate with them. Plus, if you're doing something a lot, it makes sense to try and be really good at it. That quest led me to a Harvard Business Review book by Dr. Nick Morgan called Can You Hear Me? How to Connect with People in a Virtual World. The Harvard Business Review website describes it as your essential communications manual for 21st century work. I'd have to agree. What's amazing about the book is that Nick wrote it well before the pandemic. It was published in 2018, but the messages it contains are obviously incredibly relevant to life under and whisper it after COVID. Nick is a speaking coach whose company Public Words helps people find their voice in a physical and virtual world. As you'll hear in our discussion, there's a very personal reason he set it up and which drives his mission to help people communicate. In case you're wondering what the human risk angle is here, let me explain. Since we're required, and even when we're not required, we'll probably want to do more virtual communication than ever before, it's important we become good at the skills we need in order to do so. As you'll hear from Nick, those aren't the same skills we need to communicate in person. If we don't master these skills, then we risk being misunderstood and we risk misunderstanding others. And as we know, misunderstandings can lead to conflict, confusion, and even chaos. So if we want to avoid being part of human risk in action, or indeed if we're tasked with managing it and want to help others avoid it, understanding how we can better communicate in a virtual world is a must-have, not a nice-to-have. It's a subject I've featured before. Links to those episodes are in the show notes, and I'll be covering again in future episodes, because we've got so much to learn about how we interact with each other using a format that doesn't come naturally to us. So whether you're listening to improve your own skills or to understand why others might struggle with a format you've mastered, please enjoy my discussion with Dr. Nick Morgan on how to connect with people in a virtual world. Nick, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Christian, it's a great pleasure to be here with you.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And look, I know all about you because, one, I've obviously researched it, but many of my listeners may not know about you and your own. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to do what you do and a little bit about what that is?
Well, it was through a shocking set of occurrences. Actually, I was tobogganing at age 17 on an icy slope. And I had all the hubris and overconfidence that a 17-year-old had. So after making it down the slope the first time, the second time I said to my buddies, we didn't go fast enough. And they said, well, if you're so smart and so cool, you take the run on your own. So I did. I crashed into a tree. I fractured my skull and went into a coma. I was in a coma for a week. Briefly died, just like in the movies, during that coma. And when I came to, they give you a test to see if your brain is intact, which is basically a sort of simple IQ test. And the old threefold orientation, who's the president, what year is it? That's a tough question to answer in the UK. They always get it wrong. So that's why you're in such trouble in your country. But in the US, we ask what president, what year is it, and how old are you, or something like that. I forget actually what they are. And then they give you sort of standard questions about math and English and things like that. Well, they don't ask you, how can you read people's body language? That's a question that never occurred to these folks. And that was the issue. I could no longer read body language. So when I went back to school, my 17-year-old buddies said, Nick, you look great. And they were being deeply sarcastic because I looked like a wreck. I'd just been in a terrible accident, and I was pale, and I had a scar running down the side of my head, and all my hair had been shaved off, and I was afraid. And I said, thanks, because I thought they were being serious. I'd lost the ability to read the body language that would have wrapped around that message saying, these guys are being sarcastic. And so once I figured that out, it was a shocking thing to discover. And I spent about a year retraining myself and getting the help of the people around me to tell me what they meant. And that whole process led to a lifelong interest in communications and specifically body language. So here I am today.
Wow. So you've literally relearned something that we've all picked up through intuition and naturally growing up. You had to start from zero, and therefore you've studied it, I guess, in detail as a matter of necessity.
Yes. For most people, it's a simple skill that they've learned early enough that it's unconscious. You don't have to think about it. When you look at your significant other or your children, if you have them, or your colleagues, your work colleagues, you can tell right away if you know them well. Are they in a good mood, a bad mood? Has something exciting just happened? Are they angry? Are they sad? You can tell these things just at a quick look, and it's mostly unconscious reading of the body language. That's what I couldn't do anymore, and so I had to relearn it consciously. So in addition to thinking about it hard, I have this sort of conscious awareness of body language, which for most people is unconscious. And so it makes me a slightly odd conversational partner because I'm always staring at what you're doing with your hands. But what it does is it helps me think about it consciously in a way, as I say, that's atypical for most people.
Fascinating. And I want to come on to explore that in more detail, but I can't pass your sort of biography by without talking about Charles Dickens, who I know has a special place in your affections. And given I'm based in the UK, it would be remiss of me not to explore that a little bit as well.
Well, yes, I actually grew up with my father reading Dickens to me. And so I was just emotionally attached to it. And then in graduate school, I studied the master and wrote my first book, which started out as my dissertation, my PhD dissertation. Wrote my first book on Dickens. And I had what I thought at the time was a very clever way of interpreting Dickens that nobody had thought of before. Now it looks very quaint in retrospect. So I don't talk about that book much anymore. But thanks for bringing it up and embarrassing me once again. I think we sold 5 copies of that book back in the day. My mother was one of the purchasers, so there might have been 4 other people who were interested. But yeah, it was a literary criticism of Dickens, and a very appreciative one. And to this day, I remain very fond of Mr. Dickens and his wonderful writing.
I will put a link to that book in the show notes, and hopefully we can bounce those numbers up a little bit, because I know that a number of my listeners are passionate about literature and love that. So we'll stick that there. Thank you for that insight there. And what I really wanted to come on and explore with you is what you do now, which is helping people communicate. And one of the reasons I came across you was I was starting to realize that I was in the business of communicating virtually, and I thought I need some help here because what I'm engaged in is unnatural and weird, and perhaps I should, if I'm going to do this as a profession, I ought to really understand it. And I was looking far and wide for a book, and I came across something that I thought was just so timely. And I was astonished to realize that you'd written the book in 2018. So you were well ahead of the curve. And I wondered what had inspired you to write Can You Hear Me at that time?
I was going around the world talking about storytelling and body language. And increasingly in the 2014, 2015, I was getting this question from the audience. They would say, well, Nick, thanks so much. This body language stuff's all very well, but actually my team is based in India and England and Canada and California, and I never see them face to face. So how does this body language stuff work? Long distance, virtually, over the inner tubes, as we like to say. And the obvious answer, my first answer was, well, duh, it doesn't. And then I thought, I'm supposed to be a communications expert. That's not a good enough answer. I better come up with a better one. So I jumped into the research and I discovered, to my shock, that what I had assumed, because I'm a technophile, I love the technology and I'm always a first adopter. I love trying new stuff out. I assumed sort of everybody else was doing the same thing and loving it as much as I did. And the answer I discovered was that's not the case. And in fact, in 2018, 5% of Fortune 1000 companies were using video conferencing on a regular basis. And then, of course, as we all know, in March 2020, that number suddenly went to 100%. So there were a lot of confused, frustrated, and angst-driven people out there.
And so you went about this really, I guess, in a similar way, possibly to the experience you described before, is really dissecting and saying, well, what is going on here, and what are the sensations that we have as we go through this process. And you in your introduction, you talk a lot about how unnatural it is, and that it's not a sort of standardized process, that technology is almost run ahead of standardized human intuition. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Yeah, that's a very good summary. I thought that the virtual world had really started accelerating with the introduction of the smartphone, the mobile phone, really the iPhone in 2007, 2008. That's when the sales suddenly started rocketing and people started spending all their time with their heads down in their cell phones. And I mean, obviously, we'd begun with email in the 1970s. And so we've been using that for a number of years. But as a neuroscientific friend of mine likes to say, we've been at email for 50 years. And what have we learned? We've learned one thing, that all caps means you're shouting. And, and so it's just, his point is, it's not a very sophisticated way of communicating, and it lacks nuance. So here's the deal. Here's the problem with it. And the sort of in one go, here's what the issue is. That we humans care about specific words, yes, and sometimes specific words matter very much, but we care even more about each other's intent. So if I say to you, in a classic example I use with audiences, I'll say, how many of you have ever sent the following email? Nice job, great job, good job. Everybody in the audience raises their hand. We're all nice people. We've sent that email from time to time. And I say, it's not a trick question, or it's a good email to send. And I'll say, would it surprise you to learn that 60% of the time that email is taken as sarcastic? And back when I was speaking in 2018 in front of live, real audiences rather than virtual ones, I'd get an audible gasp from people. I couldn't believe that. And I'd say, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, how could the other person be so stupid as to misread what's obviously meant in a 2-word email? And I'll say, that's understandable, but it's the wrong question. The right question is, how do I make my intent clear in a virtual means where the standard ways we have of reading each other's intent, which is through the 5 senses, face to face, it's the wink, the nod, the smile, the touch on the arm, whether the person is leaning close to us or leaning away from us, it's all those subtle body language signals. All of that's taken away in the virtual world for the most part. And we can talk about video conferencing because while we can see each other in video conference, yet still there are a number of technological tricks there that mean we're not getting the full story in terms of body language. So we're not getting each other's intent with any clarity. And that's the real issue, lacking clarity of intent. If I can't tell exactly what I think you mean, then I'm going to do something that seems odd at first, but makes perfect sense when you understand it, which is I'm going to assume the worst. I'm going to assume that you don't like me. I'm going to assume that you're bored, that you're disengaged. And so this is what happens to everybody on an audio conference when they say something brilliant and they wait for a response. And there's a millisecond while everybody lunges for the mute button and tries to figure out where they are and get off their email and that sort of thing. And what happens in that half second or so? Does anybody ever assume, oh, they think what I said was so brilliant, they're stunned into silence? No, nobody ever says that. They assume, oh, they don't like it, they're not interested. That's a negative assumption that we make. Lacking information through the 5 senses, we assume the worst. Now, why do we do that? Well, because imagine your primordial ancestors in a cave somewhere. Suddenly you're not getting information through the 5 senses about how safe you are. Your brain's job is to keep you alive. The appropriate thing to do is to say, danger, I'm not sure whether we're safe here or not. Let's panic. Let's go negative. Let's assume that the woolly mammoth is about to attack. And so that's how our brains work. They're trying to keep us alive, lacking information about other people's intent, human intent, through the 5 senses. We're going to assume the worst. That's the virtual world. And that's why we all struggle so much in it. In a nutshell, there's lots of particular examples within the various kinds of technologies, but that's the overall issue.
And it's fascinating when you depict it in those terms, because it really is. It's not just that the technologies run ahead of us. It's almost sort of mental jet lag in many respects in this, but it's also, it doesn't appear to have been designed in a manner that gets the most out of us. We've let some software engineers loose to do some clever things, but actually many of the software packages and the tools that we use are suboptimal and they haven't been designed around the human condition.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I could say something snarky about how engineers designed it. So, of course, it isn't built for communication. But when you think about it, the original purpose of email, for example, was for people working for the Defense Department in the United States to send each other files and highly technical bits of information. And so they set it up to be easy to attach files and whatnot, but they weren't worried about whether the other person loved the email and loved the sender of the email or not. That was the low on their list. So they were just trying to find convenient, fast ways to get information across. There's an interesting twist for the telephone, which we think of as a very intimate form of connection in a sort of old-fashioned sense. And that is that the engineers who designed that said, well, the human voice has a weirdly and extraordinarily wide response on a wide range of frequencies. And so your human voice creates noise from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And for your listeners who aren't familiar with that, that just means the pitch at which you're vocalizing. And you don't just vocalize at a specific pitch, you also have overtones and undertones. So this is getting a little geeky and a little complicated, but you don't really need to understand that except to know that the human voice responds on a very wide range of frequencies. Well, engineers saw that and they said that's going to be hard to convey over a phone line back with the technology of the day. So we're going to compress that signal down to just the narrow bandwidth right around anywhere between about 100 and 350 hertz. That's wide enough to get the basic pitch at which you're speaking so I can understand you, but it cuts out all the overtones and undertones of the human voice. It makes it harder to hear the subtleties of the human voice. And specifically, it makes it harder to hear the emotions. And so when you're listening to somebody on an audio conference, you think they're hearing how they're feeling, but you're not. You're hearing a kind of muffled, muted version of how they're hearing. And so we tend to underestimate each other's emotional responses. We think everybody else is bored because it sounds like they're not very engaged. Well, they may be, but who knows? Because the signal of their voice that we would normally hear loud and clear face to face is getting squished to be transmitted over the phone line. And then the same thing happens in video conferences because guess what? They use the same compression ratios. The engineers didn't bother to invent new ones for video conferencing.
I sort of was thinking that in visual terms. I mean, what you're basically saying there is we're hearing in black and white as opposed to hearing in full color. We are missing some of those pieces. And the worst bit is we're not aware that we're missing those pieces. So if we could acknowledge and sort of go, well, I know that that's not there, so I can compensate for that. But as you point out, it's quite in a way, it's a clever trick because it fools us into thinking that we are getting that. And so we're operating on limited information. And so naturally, we're not necessarily going to draw the right conclusions from that.
Yeah, you raised the key point, which is exactly that it's not only that we're not getting full information, but that we're not aware of it. And so we think we're operating on full, I think I'm hearing you correctly. And I'm making all kinds of assumptions in the moment based on that, but I'm actually not getting the nuances. And even in a video conference where we can see each other, we think we're seeing the three-dimensional of the human being, but of course we're not. We're seeing a two-dimensional representation. So what does that do? Well, it flattens out your face, which means it's harder to read your facial expressions. So I think, once again, I'm getting the full range of your facial expressions on video, but I'm not. I'm seeing a two-dimensional flattened version of that. And so once again, I'm liable to misinterpret what I'm seeing.
And so as you went on this journey of sort of dissecting all the different forms, the software, if you like, and the methods that we have of communicating, the key thing that seems to come out is stuff isn't there that we really need, that we're used to having. Right. And so how did you go about exploring, firstly, what the result of the bits that we're missing, and secondly, how we can kind of compensate, what can we do about it?
Yeah, so that's the important question, isn't it? Once we know that there's something missing, how can we put it back in? The interesting thing, for example, about video conference is not only are there various flattenings in two dimensions that I talked about, but we have this sixth sense called proprioception. It's one they don't teach you in school, sadly. Maybe they do at British schools. They don't in American schools. So.
They didn't at mine.
Yes. So proprioception is arguably the most important sense, and yet they never tell us about it. It's the sense where you keep track of where you are in space so you don't bump into things and where everybody around you is in space. And so it creates the minor miracle that anybody who sleeps with anybody else on a nightly basis will understand. When you think about it, you don't roll over and punch your significant other in the face on a regular basis. Why? Not just because you're a nice person, but because your proprioception sense is going 24/7 saying, I'm here in space and there's this person next to me. I better not hit him or her. All right. So on video conferencing, the proprioception sense goes haywire because it can't tell where the other person is. The other person appears to be 3 feet away. That would be weird because he or she is way too small. And if you get on to be 3 feet away, and if you get on what we call a Brady Bunch screen where you have 6 or more people, they look even weirder. They all seem to be stacked one on top of one another. You can't tell where they are. So what happens is that creates stress. And that's really the essence of the virtual experience for all of us. Lacking the information that we need, we're not aware of it consciously, but unconsciously, we're getting stressed out. And hence Zoom fatigue, hence the hostility that a lot of people experience in various relations with customers who assume the worst, for example, or just online and all the negative activity that goes on online. So what do we do about it? The first thing we have to do is with people that we work with often, and significant others and friends and that kind of anybody we're trying to communicate with now, we have to work very hard to make our intent clearer than we would if we were just communicating face to face. We can't be like generals fighting the last war in new terrain. We have to communicate in a way that understands that, hey, my intentions are not coming through clearly, so I need to make them clear to you. So on a video conference, when I'm talking to somebody that I'm relating to on an ongoing basis, I'm going to need to say things like, I'm really excited to see you again. This is wonderful. I'm going to have to exaggerate my language, my emotional language. Your fellow countrymen will love to do this because you're naturally so emotional and expressive. This is going to go over big in the UK. But so that's the first thing you need to do. You need to assume that your intent is not necessarily coming through clearly in the way it would if you were communicating face to face. And you need to start to ask yourself, how can I make that intent clear? Now, on a video conference, you can amp up your activity just a little bit. And one of the simple tricks, for example, is when you think about a video conference, it's virtually always just head and shoulders. And yet our hand gestures are an important part of how we communicate with somebody else. They're important in a number of ways. One of the obvious ones is we gesture when we're excited, but we also gesture to reinforce meaning. So the experts talk about beat gestures. Beat gestures are gestures you use when you're emphasizing a syllable or a word to show what's the most important syllable in this word so that you understand it. What's the most important word in this phrase so you understand it. If I keep my hands out of the screen, then I'm just making myself that much harder to understand on the video conference. And when there's any kind of chatter and crosstalk and people interrupting each other, as they always do on video conferencing, that will just compound the problem. So one of the things you need to do is think, again, my intent isn't going to be clear. Even my very words aren't necessarily going to be clear. So I need to work harder to express what it is I'm saying by using gestures, bringing them up into the screen, and by checking in on a regular basis to make sure that my intent is coming through. And I'll say to people who have to work with each other on an ongoing basis, whether they have video conferencing or audio conferencing, I'll say, assign somebody to keep track of the entire crew, the entire team. How are they doing? And you can check in by asking for a red, green, yellow kind of like a stoplight. Do you say amber in the UK? So a red, amber, green. And that's a very simple way that most people are comfortable doing to check in and see how folks are. And it's harder on a video conference to go into a lot of emotional detail about how you've had a fight with your spouse or something like that. So it's better to use those kind of simplified check-ins. But we need to start doing that kind of thing. We need to monitor the relationships and the health of the relationships in a conscious way, because it's not going to be done in the unconscious way we rely on when we can meet face to face.
It's fascinating when you talk in these terms because it feels really fake. So what you've just described there It's the sort of thing I would expect somebody who, if you're appearing on television, they'll teach you some techniques because the screen distorts that. So we think naturally, if you're somebody's appearing on television, you'll be taught the way to handle that medium. But that often results in you doing things that don't feel natural. And what you're basically saying, reading between the lines here, is that we all need to pick up, not necessarily exactly the same ones, but similar skills where there's an excess of exaggeration, do things you wouldn't ordinarily do, exaggerate things. So do things that might feel excessive to you, but work because of the nature of the format. And that, I guess, adds to the tiredness because you're adding to the burden. Not only is it what you're not getting from the screen and you're sort of trying to compute that piece, but you're also saying, I have to put much more into communicating than I would do ordinarily.
That's right. If you want the communication to be successful. Now, if you want it to be an ongoing disaster, then no, just be yourself. Just go on carrying on as you have been. That's an option, not a good one, but it's an option. But more seriously, the way I like to think about it is you should always be asking yourself the question, how did what I just say make you feel, meaning the other person? Was my intent clear to the other person? And if it wasn't, you can pause, you can ask them. But you can also think about how could I make that intent clear? And you can make it clear through the words you use and through whatever gestural language is available to you. If it's on video conference, you have more, obviously, than you do on an audio conference. And even an email, which is the worst form of communication, one of the things I urge people to do is to start using emojis. And this has a really funny reaction because if you're over 40, 45 or so, you think, no, I can't do that. Emojis are undignified, they're silly, they're childish. And if you're under 40, then you go, yeah, I'm using them already. So there's a real generational divide there. But think about it, the very simple, basic emojis, the smiley face and that kind of thing, that reduces the possibility that 60% of the time your email is going to be taken as sarcastic. And so that's an easy one, a no-brainer, a way to start making sure that people don't read negativity into your communications, so your written communications, which they are going to do. The research shows us.
I'm sort of struck that one of the ways that we can learn how to play in this space is to look at things like the social media network. So let's look at YouTube, let's look at TikTok. So these things work because they work well in the format. And yet they are the antithesis of what you might think of as a corporate communications tool. So many people that are working for grown-up companies that are there would sort of shy away from, well, that's for the kids, or that's not professional. And yet it's interesting that these things that work, when things go viral, it's because the communication has in some way, shape or form moved individuals to share it and moved individuals to respond to it. And I think it's really interesting that almost we need to lose some of the kind of traditional thinking around this and say, actually, we have much to learn from things that are communicated very effectively that might not sit neatly in a kind of traditional view of what corporates ought to do.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because if you think about those formats and those programs like TikTok and Instagram and that sort of thing, the things that do go viral tend to be emotional. They have an immediate emotional content. It's a cute puppy or a kid doing a dance or something adorable or something terrifying or something horrible. I mean, those are the things that we react to and spread and make viral. So the key there is emotion. Those formats are good at putting in the emotion that our standard business communications lack. And we used to think in the business world that being logical rather than emotional was a good thing. When I started working and first had to put on a tie, I still remember how to do that, I think. What we were told was the workplace is a place where you check your emotions at the door. You bring in your logical mind and you go to work on these problems, and you don't make a fuss. You don't get worked up, and you don't cry, and you don't get angry and that kind of thing. And you lose face if you show too much emotion. Well, all that's changed now, and we're living in a more authentic age. And in fact, from our leaders, we require displays of emotion in order to believe their authenticity. And I think the same has trickled down to all the rest of us too, that we need to show that we're authentic human beings. And it's just that much harder to do when we're all virtual. And so we need to up our game. But before, and I would just push back a little bit because I understand the discomfort, as you're saying. You have to sort of up your game, be more, crank up the emotion, and you learn what you might do on TV, and that might feel awkward and that kind of thing. Yeah, sure. That's the sort of next level stuff. You learn how to be, to appear emotional. But to begin with, you can just start asking and taking the time to say, how are you doing, and how are you feeling? And I mean, we have the excuse of a pandemic, after all, to check up on each other. So I think we can make that naturally part of our conversation, and that doesn't have to feel too awkward. In fact, what I've noticed is the danger is the opposite. You ask somebody how they are, and you used to get a 2-word response. Now you get 45 minutes of, let me tell you how I am and how it's been. It hasn't been great. I've been locked up here for months. I can't stand it anymore. Yeah, that's the, you may get the sort of inverse, too much information rather than too little.
And so you started to explore this in 2018, and the book, or even before then, and the book comes out. And of course, then it turned. I mean, this must have been fascinating for you, because all of a sudden, everybody, whether they want to or not, everybody is having to think about this particular topic. And so suddenly, you've gone from something that sort of a few people might have recognized was a useful skill into something that undeniably people are. You have to get to grips with this issue. You may not want to learn it. You may not like it. You may want to switch your camera off. How was that for you?
Well, it was extraordinary. My editor called up weeping tears of joy when the pandemic hit, because the book suddenly started selling again. But seriously, what happened was I got asked to do a huge number of webinars and speeches, if you will, in the virtual medium to companies that were genuinely suffering. And trying to figure out, how do we do this? How do we keep going? Why is it so hard? And it turned out to be a great relief to people to hear that, no, there's not something wrong with you. Zoom fatigue is real. It's caused by the mismatch between your unconscious forms of communication and the limitations of the technology. And so that was just a relief. People feel like, oh, I don't have to blame myself. It's not something bad I'm doing. Learning how to up your game, sure, that takes some work. Learning how to be more articulate about your intention, your emotions, that takes some effort. But at least it's a game you can play and win and figure out how to do. So it gives you a path forward. So people have responded very very helpfully and graciously, and they've given me a lot of positive feedback, which has been really nice, because as anybody knows who's done one, doing a webinar is probably the most god-awful form of human communication that's ever been invented. And I said that in the book. And so in fact, the first webinar that I gave, which was, I think, March 15th, I got the first call from the company, 2020, saying, help, what do we do here? The first fellow who introduced me said, Nick, I read your book, and I see here in the chapter on webinars, you say it's the worst form of communications invented, and yet here you are giving one. Tell us about that. That was my start in this long journey. It's been great.
Yeah, and it's sort of, as I say, I was looking for a guide to sort of how to navigate this, and came across the book and was relieved that someone had done the heavy lifting for me, because I think one of the other things that's fascinating is, of course, part of the nature that you are literally on your own, sat in front of a screen. And so it's not, it really does feel like a solitary experience. And so having somebody that's kind of looked at this, and I think the emotional there's the challenge of doing it, but the emotional response to it is quite draining and worrying. And I think that sense of digital loneliness, where I'm not getting the feedback I'm used to, I'm worried about what's going on in the outside world, I'm trapped in the same room for hours on end, all plays into the same piece. So I think it was a real pressure cooker environment in many respects for us. And I'm not sure that we've necessarily all adapted to it in the way that I thought we would adapt much more quickly.
Yeah, one of the surprising, sort of unexpected and unintentional results of writing that book was I learned, or I realized, how much we humans are designed to connect with each other, and how much we do that unconsciously. And normally all that work is carried on with very little effort from us, again, consciously, because it's our unconscious mind that's doing the work. We get together, we used to get together in rooms and in restaurants and bars, and we'd connect, we share emotions, even if we're English and we're doing it in a very reserved and proper way, we're still connecting. And that I hadn't realized just how important that kind of communal aspect of human life was to us all. But the pandemic has become one long endless experiment in precisely that. How do people do when they're isolated, even if they can connect with these apparently useful forms of technology? And the answer is very clear. All the mental health indicators are going in the wrong direction right now. People are more depressed, they're more lonely, they're abusing more drugs, they're drinking more, and so on and so forth. We're all suffering from that because we need that human connection. It's why we used to go to football games. It's why we used to go to rock and roll concerts, and why we used to go to political rallies. Even is because we humans love to get together in groups and share emotions, and that's very difficult to do in this format. There is a touch of good news. I can't resist saying that there are technologies now that are being developed, which I think take it a step further beyond video conferencing and audio conferencing and text-based communications. So the next pandemic, when that comes, hopefully if it's a few years away, we'll have some new technology in place that will help us get through it a little bit better. But it's no substitute, even then, it's no substitute for face-to-face communications. And we just have to be aware of that and realize that we humans need that. We need to get back to that when we can.
And I'd love to explore that technological piece, because my sort of next question was going to be around, okay, so there are these constraints and we can try and remold people and get them to do things that will make the most of what we have. But actually, shouldn't we be trying to design solutions to the problem? So I'm fascinated what you've seen that sort of looks like it's addressing this problem, and where do you see those solutions coming?
Yeah. I had demonstrated for me the other day a really remarkable, and there are a number of companies working on this, a really remarkable technology where you do still have to put on a sort of headset thing. So you feel like you're on the holodeck of the Enterprise, but and it's a little clunky, but that presumably will get better and get lighter and smaller as all technology seems to do. And what happens is you're put into imagine a regular office workspace with a conference room table and a nice whiteboard on one end and some internet enabled screen on the other end, and you see all the people that you're meeting with in the room with you, and you can interact as if you're moving around in the space. And the trick is remarkably good in terms of proprioception. So the first anxiety that I talked about, how your proprioception sense is exhausted because you're in low stress mode on video conferencing, that goes away because you feel like you're in the space with other people. You can walk up to the whiteboard and write on it and pull objects out of the thin air, because it is the internet after all, and put them on the whiteboard. You can turn around and see how somebody else is reacting. It's very clever, and it does give the feeling that you're in the room with other people. So, and if that's the early stages for this kind of technology, I think down the road it's going to get quite remarkable. So I think we'll end up with technology that gives us a much better verisimilitude, a much better feeling of being in the room with other people. And that's what we crave. So it may be that the end is you and I sitting in little isolated pods under the illusion that we're actually talking to other people in the room with them. But if so, bring it on, because if the technology is good enough, it will be able to.
I've sort of got a vision of the Matrix.
Yeah, exactly.
And perception, of course, is everything. So as long as we feel like we're in that space, that sort of solves the problem. If we can't solve the reality.
Right.
And I'm also intrigued because there's a danger that one looks at this thing and goes, this is all awful, this is terrible, we're being put through all these pressures and we need the technology to rescue us. And I'm fascinated by what have you found that's good about this way of communication? Where does the virtual beat the physical, if indeed that's possible?
Yeah, that's a nice question, because there are some things about it that actually work better. One of the things I do is coach executives and speakers on how to show up with presence and charisma. And my first reaction last March was that, that whole business is just going to evaporate for the next X number of months or however long it's going to last. And to my astonishment, we found that you really can recreate a good deal of that feeling and that work in the virtual space. And it has some advantages. One of the advantages is I used to get together for a day. We'd all fly in from somewhere with the executive team or a particular executive. And the pressure was on us to get everything done in that day because we'd all got on airplanes to do it, and airplanes cost money and so on. And now what we can do is we can take just a little bit out of the day. So an hour and a half, we can do some work, and then we can come back to it a few days later, a week later. And that gives you time to digest and to think about it and to practice it and whatnot. So it actually becomes more thoughtful rather than having the pressure of having to get it done all at once. That's the first thing. The second thing is that while we're on lockdown and we're therefore seeing into each other's living rooms or studies or dining rooms or, at worst case, messy bedrooms with unmade beds, that creates a kind of intimacy that if I were working with a client, it might be years or never that I would necessarily end up in their homes having a conversation. And we even though we're professionals and even though we know what's going on, we respond in slightly different ways when we appear to be in each other's rooms, homes, and there's a kind of disarming aspect to that, and a kind of intimacy that develops that I think many people have noticed and commented on. So it's not perfect, and of course there are times when you wish people weren't looking into your intimate space, but on the whole, I think that has led to some deeper conversations and some more profound connections because we go with a little less of the sort of games, a little less of the sort of persona that we put on when we go to work or when we went to work in the past and dressed up and hit the corporate office and started playing a role. We're maybe a little more human in our home spaces, a little less likely to do that. And so you can sometimes cut to the chase in a way that it's harder to do in the workplace, I think. So I'm hoping we can maintain a bit of that when we go back to work.
I love that because as you were talking, we sort of shifted from, the virtual world's really artificial and we have to practice these new skills to be able to master it, and we're losing all these. And then as you were talking, I was thinking, well, actually, to your point around acting at work and putting clothes on so that we can be professional and going into an office, there's a heck of a lot of constructs in the old world, for want of a better phrase, that probably don't get the most out of people either. So I love the idea of sort of, we have town hall meetings in companies, and we do that is a historic concept. We use the name, but it's not really this. It's taken from an era of way back when. We have meeting structures that are not necessarily optimal, where we kind of go through the motions. Mm-hmm. It's not natural at all. And so I'm fascinated around your thoughts about do you see in the conversations you're having and in your work changes to that? So even if we did largely return to offices in the way that was there before, are you seeing changes in that space as well? Because I think it's fascinating to say, okay, we should start to challenge traditional orthodoxy. And some of the things that we sort of did probably without really thinking about it, actually, they're not that effective. But we've just always done them because it's what we were handed. The stone tablets that were handed down to us in the office told us that that's how we did. This is what a meeting looks like. This is how you run it. Actually, is that the most effective way to communicate?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think when we do come back to the office, we'll have options in a way that we didn't before. And that's probably a good thing. I think right at first, we're all going to rush out in the streets and hug each other just because it's been that sort of...
Be the roaring 20s, right?
Yeah, right. That loneliness is there's going to be a lot of happy hours going on because that's all built up and we need to get that out of our system. But I think a year out, 2 years out, you'll see the pendulum kind of settle down at a new place. And we'll have much more choice about what kind of meetings to have and how to conduct them. I mean, think about the the difference in the signal that you send. Let's say I'm meeting you for the first time. And I say, no problem, Christian, I'll jump on a plane. I'll fly to London and I'll meet you wherever you are and we can meet face to face. That says one thing about my commitment to the nature, the importance of the meeting. If, on the other hand, I say, yeah, let's do this as a digital thing, it'll be efficient, we'll save time, then you're going to read it in another way. So what it does is it broadens the possibility of the ways in which we can interact. And it sets a new set of signals for us to read, doesn't it? So that's fun for people who care about communications like me. But it means we have more options than we had before. And whenever we get more options like that, I think the universe expands, the pie expands, and that's a good thing. And we'll get better at handling the video conferencing and that kind of thing. Most people by now have learned where the mute button is, and they know how to find it and unmute themselves when they talk. Although I still see on a daily basis, I'll have meetings with people, and somebody sometime during the hour fumbles for the mute button. So it seems to be slow. I go back to my old friend, the neuroscientist, who says we've learned one thing. All caps means shouting. And it still feels that way. I think we humans are slow to take up these kind of technologies where it's about unconscious habits. It's very hard to bring unconscious habits to the conscious mind and then to work on them. So this is not going to be simple. It's not going to be easy. And I think it's going to take a surprising amount of time. But at least we'll have the options to do things in a variety of ways.
We are still seeing stories of people being caught doing inappropriate things on Zoom calls. And, it's not, the beginning, as you say, it's people getting used to it. The basic errors were happening. And
Right.
Some of them were quite entertaining, some massive. But we're still seeing now, it's not even sort of sophisticated mistakes. It is really basic, really inappropriate stuff.
Yeah.
And it's astonishing. Now, I recognize those are the ones that hit the headlines and that not, the average level is improving substantially. But it's still astonishing, as you say, that there are, I can't even say old habits die hard, because some of the things that people are caught doing on camera, sort of, you would hope that they wouldn't have done that in the old world. And I find that quite surprising. So this idea of sort of we haven't adapted well, is still being borne out today by people that really should know better.
Yeah, there's the disjunct between our unconscious normal behaviors and our conscious ones. And once you get used to something at a preliminary level, like Zoom, and then you can forget that, oh yeah, that camera means that somebody else is watching me the whole time. So I better not pick my nose or do or fall asleep. My favorite one the other day was a lawyer who was trying to argue a case in front of a judge. I don't know if this got as far as the UK, but in the US, and what was showing up was a cat face, an animated cat face.
Right, yeah, we did see that.
I think his daughter or girlfriend or something had put it on.
So he says, right?
How many cats did he actually own? That's the question. Because more than two, and you're a crazy cat person. So there you are.
But that's a really interesting point, actually, because you sort of, on the one hand, you say, why haven't they got to grips with it? And the point you've just made, they've got almost too familiar with it and have forgotten. So to a certain extent, that does show that we are able to adapt. We're just not adapting in a particularly helpful way. And we're going through a basic phase of evolution with this stuff.
Yeah, we do adapt, and we sort of learn the basic rules. But the deeper adaptations, that's what takes the time, and that's what's hard to do. And that doesn't go easily and naturally for us in the kinds of behaviors like the reading of body language and that sort of thing, because you can take a lifetime, as I have, trying to learn how to do that well. So
I'm not sure.
And that's hilarious. Alexa is just talking to me now because of something I said. Talk about unintentional responses from technology. But yeah, where was I? So we're stuck with this. We're in a situation where the technology is not as good as it needs to be for us humans to be most human in. And so we have to be a little inhuman in the short run in order to make it work for us. And that's hard.
And your whole, I call it a mission because I can genuinely tell there's a passion behind it. And I think your backstory is fascinating to understanding that. But it's sort of like, if I look at the book and the work that you do, it's bringing people to a level of competency and familiarity and comfort, sort of upping their game, almost playing catch up to a process, sort of plugging a gap that's there. And I wonder what your thoughts were around, should this be something that we naturally teach everybody? Because, as you and I were talking before the recording, companies have traditionally done things like presentation skills, which sit alongside time management and a whole load of other sort of things you ought to know. Generally, if we're honest, historically not been taught particularly effectively. And it's very learning broke by learning. It's almost like the company can say, we sent you on that course, you should know this stuff.
Right.
And so I sort of look at it and say those things were clearly not as not fulfilling the need. What you've done is sort of plugged a gap. But I wonder, are we at a stage where we ought to be teaching in the same way that we teach people digital literacy and financial literacy and basic? We really ought to be plugging this in earlier on into people's careers and I guess maybe as part of their education in general.
Yeah, I think it's a need that there are various reasons why we find it hard to make part of a curriculum. I agree absolutely that it should be part of a curriculum. I mean, it would put me out of business, but I'd be very happy about that.
Well, I was sort of suggesting you might be the one responsible for managing it.
Oh, thanks.
Rather than I'm not seeking to disintermediate you.
Yeah. No problem. It'll be a long time before that happens. But the real issue here is that we find it a strange way of thinking to say that I can show up with the emotions I want to show up with. So when think back before the pandemic, when we used to go to work in workplaces, and we would think about the day and we'd think about the schedule and we'd put on the clothes that were appropriate for that. And if we were meeting with the boss, say, and it was an annual review, we might dress a little snazzier than we would on a normal working day. We might do our best to dress to kill if we're trying to impress a new client or something like that. So the idea of putting on work clothes doesn't surprise us. And most people have the idea that, right, I can't go in if I've got an issue with a relative or I'm having problems at home. I can't go into work sort of looking hangdog and miserable, at least not completely. So there's some sense of emotion management. But the idea that you should pick your best self and go in and show that to the workplace or in an important meeting, that kind of thing still strikes us as a little odd. And yet my argument is that we humans should be able to choose that, just as we choose the clothes we wear. Why not choose the emotions we're going to show up with? And it's not, I mean, I think that comes from having coached people over the years who have worked with celebrities and politicians and that sort of thing. The kind of people who when there's a show to put on, they know they have to put on a show. If they're feeling bad that night, a candidate, somebody who's running for president or elected office, can't say, well, I just don't feel it tonight. I'm going to show up. I'm only going to give it 20% of my effort. Doesn't work in that situation. And most of us are selling ourselves short if we don't allow ourselves the same permission, which is to choose our best selves to show up with. And so I think the virtual world we're living in now just sort of highlights that especially last March, 100% of people weren't showing up with their best selves in the virtual spaces. We were all trying to figure it out, and it's been up and down since then, as we were noting before. But this is an opportunity to say, okay, how do I want the world to see me? How much effort am I willing to put in to do that? And have I thought about choosing the aspects, the parts of my personality that I want to put forward? I have a right to do that.
And it's funny. I've seen sort of people really try and get on top of this and really try and understand it, own it. I've seen the opposite as well, which is the kind of almost you get on a call and they're intentionally useless. And there's a sort of, oh, I'm a bit technophobic. I don't really understand this stuff. And I heard this a few days ago from someone, and my initial reaction was, that's entertaining. And then I just thought, that is lazy and unacceptable. And far from being endearing, actually just transmitted, and I don't think they intended this at all. I think they thought it was sort of a fun excuse, and they're probably better than they're making out, but they were pretty terrible. And I'm fascinated by that thing, is that sort of, to your point around politicians almost faking it. You just have to look the part. You're not allowed to bring. So on the one hand, you're required to be authentic. Be man of the people or woman of the people. Bring that sort of thing. But equally, don't actually bring your true self there. But you need to bring what people are expecting. And I think there's something fascinating that we're all having to, based on this, we're all having to be a little bit better at acting and a little bit better at presenting ourselves. And so where traditionally it might have been the art of writing that was the skill. So you judge someone by how well they can write. Nowadays, it's much more around how they present and speak. And so that is a necessary skill set to survive, I guess, particularly in the knowledge economy, where you're hired not so much for physical labor, but for your brain and your presenting skills in some respects.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's because the world has become a much more video-oriented world than a written-oriented world. And I say that as an author with true regret and a lover of Dickens, where we started with true regret. It's hard to get, as I learned when I used to teach in the academic world, hard to get young people these days to read 600, 900-page novels. Because they say, well, show me the 5-minute video. Let's get this done quickly. And there's a sense in which the world is speeded up and we need information faster, and video in many ways is more efficient. But the key point here is that, yes, it is a form of acting, and yes, it is a form of faking it till you make it in a sense. But more important than that, though, in the longer term, what you want to think about is, what is that real, authentic part of me that I want to show to the world? Because it's too much of a strain if you completely fake it for the world. It's too much of a distance from your own real personality. So what I coach people to do is, let's figure out what's the authentic part of you that you want to present to the world. The world doesn't want to see all of you. That we say TMI, too much information, when you do that, right? We don't want to know the whole story. We want to know the interesting parts of your story. And that's true for all humans everywhere. It's even true of the people who love you. They don't want to hear the same stories over and over again. They don't want to, they know how your day went if you've told them many, many times before, right? They want to hear something interesting, something novel, something new. So it's never the case that humanity wants to hear everything about you. So this whole argument that the difference between faking it till you make it and authenticity means that you have to end up being some sort of disingenuous person or a liar or something like that. Not the case. What we're doing here is we're picking that aspect, those real aspects of you that are going to work well in the world, that are effective in the world. And this is something we learned in grade school. We learned how to put our best foot forward and how to show up and get the work done. Our lazy selves, the ones who would just rather stay on the couch and eat cold cereal and drink beer before noon, that's not going to get the job done. And so
I love that image. That's great.
Never me. Let me just say, you maybe, but not me.
Right.
So
I couldn't possibly comment.
Right. So the idea is that we have this opportunity in a digital world. You're right. It does feel like more of a performance, but nonetheless, we still have the opportunity to show up as our authentic selves, but just make a choice. It's not the whole range of your entire humanity. It's aspects of it that the world will find interesting. My grandmother taught me this, actually, back in the day when I would chatter at the family table in the high holidays when I was permitted to sit near my grandmother. And I would chatter. She would say, "Nicholas, tell me something about you." And I would chatter away with something completely inconsequential and uninteresting to Grandma. And she would say, "Not of general interest." And I learned very quickly from her that if I was to say something to keep Grandma's interest, it had to be of general interest. There had to be a point that would apply to other people. And I'm still playing that game years later. Thank you, Grandma.
That's a lovely story. I think that's a wonderful, uplifting piece, because I think in a world where there's a lot of challenges we're facing, I love this idea of actually what we're doing is we're getting the best out of people. So let's find the things that we all individually have, and let's maximize those, as opposed to and I'm struck really when we look at a thing I've been looking at recently is jobs, and when we look at people's appraisals or year-end review, it's all about how so there's the good bits, and then the feedback is all around how you haven't fitted yourself into the slot that they've created for you. So where are you falling short of the expectations we have based on? And I sort of think that's quite dispiriting. And actually, we ought to much more be able to say to people, we've hired you, you're unique. Let's get the best out of you, not the most necessarily, the best. And I love this idea that you're saying, actually, what we're trying to do here is bring out those things that really deliver the best you can potentially deliver. Present yourself in the best way, communicate most effectively by being genuinely authentic for those parts of it that makes most sense to bring out. And I think that's a lovely uplifting message. So rather than we're having to reprogram you, it's actually how do we draw those things out? And I think that grandmother analogy is all around saying, be yourself, but be yourself in a high quality, impressive way.
Yeah, bring your best, give it your best shot. Bring your A game. Pick the metaphor you want, but it's time, especially in the virtual world, to do that.
Fantastic. Well, look, I know you're an incredibly busy man. Thank you so much for your insights. It's been entertaining and enlightening. Thank you above all for the book, because literally about a year ago, I was lost in a wilderness and came across it. And I've been avidly diving in from time to time. So highly recommended. Details of that in the show notes, plus links to your website so people could find you. I also recommend following you on social media, because there's a ton of stuff that comes out that's always insightful, interesting. So thank you for all of that. I guess final piece for me is what's next for you? Where does the journey continue, and what are your next areas of study and interest?
I'm writing a book on the voice. I think ultimately for those of us in the knowledge working business, while writing is important, it does come down to the voice. And so how do you develop your strongest, best individual voice? And I mean that both in a technical sense, so your voice just simply sounds good, because I've worked with people whose voices are awful, and their bosses call up and say, can you make their voices better? But also, how can you just bring out your full humanity in your voice? Most of us only use about 50% of our voice at any one time. You've got a good one. So it's been a pleasure to listen to yours, but then you've practiced this for a while, so you have to be good, right? And many people don't bring their full voice in, and that's partly a psychological sort of philosophical issue, and it's partly a technical one. So exploring that's my next thing.
Well, thank you for the kind words, and look forward to that. And I will try and drag you back onto the podcast to talk about that if you're available when that comes out, because that would be an absolute pleasure. But Nick, thank you so much for all that you've done, and above all, for being a fabulous guest on the podcast.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate having the chance to chat. We humans need to connect.
Amazing. So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My huge thanks to Nick for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about Nick's work and Can You Hear Me? How to connect with people in a virtual world, have a look in the show notes. There are links to both of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you have yet to leave a 5-star rating for the show, please do so. It really does help. Just do that on whichever platform you're listening to the show on. To find out more about Human Risk, the company, the work that I do with my clients, including training, coaching, speaking, and consulting, have a look at human-risk.com. There's information about the services there. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.